Beneath the full moon. It was the kind of town you drive through and never remember. Tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Willow Creek had been around for centuries, but it seemed stuck in time. Its narrow streets lined with aging brick houses and a single diner where the locals gathered to share stories and gossip. For Sam and his friends, the town was just a pit stop. They were backpacking across the country, chasing adventures and cheap thrills, and had chosen Willow Creek for one reason: the legend of the Willow Creek werewolf. It's probably just some old local myth, Sarah said, sipping coffee in the corner booth of the diner. All these towns have some kind of creepy story to scare outsiders, Mark added with a grin, stretching out his legs beneath the table. Yeah, but this one's different, Sam countered, flipping through a dusty local history book he picked up at the gas station. It's been going on for years. Every full moon, someone disappears. They never find the bodies. Just blood. Lots of blood. Sarah rolled her eyes, but she couldn't hide the unease creeping across her face. The old waitress, who had been refilling their coffee, overheard and chimed in, her voice low and raspy. "Y'all ain't from around here, are ya?" Sam looked up, intrigued. "Nope, just passing through. We heard about the werewolf." The woman's hands trembled slightly as she sat down the coffee pot. "You kids think it's funny, don't ya? Just a story. But it ain't. Best you head on out before dark. Moon's full tonight." She glanced out the window, where the sun was already beginning to dip behind the mountains. Mark laughed. "Werewolves? Come on, lady. Those are just not a joke," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "People disappear. And when the moon's full, something comes out of the woods. I've seen it. Everyone here has. You'd be smart to leave before it finds you." Silence settled over the table, and for the first time that day, none of them felt like laughing. But they didn't leave. That night, the group decided to camp just outside the town, near the edge of the dense forest. The air was heavy, with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sky above was a brilliant indigo. The full moon hanging low and fat, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As they set up their tents, the conversation turned back to the waitress's warning. "She was probably just trying to scare us," Mark said, though he kept glancing nervously toward the dark line of trees. "Maybe," Sarah replied, "but we should keep the fire going, just in case." Sam didn't say much. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The woods around them seemed too quiet, too still, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Hours passed, and the fire crackled softly, casting long shadows that danced among the trees. The full moon illuminated the clearing, making the night unnaturally bright. Sarah had fallen asleep by the fire, and Mark was dozing in his tent. Sam stared into the darkness beyond the flickering flames, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, something darting between the trees. "Sarah," he whispered, shaking her gently. "Wake up." She stirred, her eyes blurry. "What is it?" "I don't know. I think something's out there." Before she could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed from the forest. It was deep and unnatural, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. Sam's blood ran cold. "What the hell was that?" Sarah gasped, stumbling to her feet. Mark burst out of his tent, wide-eyed. "Did you guys hear that?" The growl came again, closer this time. Sam grabbed the flashlight and shined it towards the tree line, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness. Then they saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, yellow and predatory, stared back at them from the shadows. The creature stepped into the moonlight, its massive form covered in matted fur, its fangs gleaming as it snarled. It was taller than any man, standing upright on two legs, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. It had clawed hands that hung at its sides, twitching as though eager to tear into flesh. For a moment, no one moved. Then, instinct took over. "Run!" Sam shouted. They sprinted toward the car, but the creature was fast, faster than anything they had ever seen. It moved like a shadow, blurring between the trees, stalking them as they crashed through the underbush. Mark was the first to fall. The werewolf lunged, knocking him to the ground with a sickening thud. His scream was cut short as claws ripped through flesh, and the air filled with the sound of bones snapping. Blood sprayed across the leaves, black under the moonlight. Sarah screamed, but Sam grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "Keep going, don't look back." They ran deeper into the woods, the creature's growls echoing behind them, growling louder, more frenzied. Sam's lungs burned, and his legs felt like they were going to give out. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't slow down, not with that thing behind them. Suddenly, Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She hit the ground hard, gasping in pain. Sam turned to help her, but the werewolf was already there, its massive frame blocking the moonlight. For a brief moment, Sam locked eyes with the creature. There was no humanity left in its gaze, only hunger. It tore into Sarah with terrifying ferocity, her screams piercing the night as the beast shredded her apart. Sam turned and ran, tears streaming down his face, his heart pounding in his chest like it was going to burst. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the forest, the lights of the town faintly visible in the distance. Gasping for air, he collapsed to his knees, his entire body shaking. Behind him, the growling had stopped. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, as if the forest itself was sighing in relief. The full moon still hung high in the sky, casting its cold light over the blood-soaked woods, and Sam knew he'd never make it back to Willow Creek alive. The Shadow's Hunger. The town of Raven Glen had always been cloaked in mystery. Its residents spoke in whispers, especially after sunset, when the thick fog rolled in from the nearby forest. They all knew the stories, passed down through generations, of the vampire that lurked in the shadows. No one had seen it for years, yet the feeling of being watched never left them. Lena, a young woman of 25, had recently moved into Ravenglen to escape the chaos of city life. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, close to the ancient forest. The townsfolk had warned her to not go out after dark and never, under any circumstance, venture into the woods. But Lena wasn't one to be scared by old folklore. She scoffed at the warnings, chalking them up to superstitious nonsense. On her first night, as the fog rolled in, she stood on her porch, staring into the dark wall of trees. A chill ran down her spine, but she brushed it off, still. As she turned to go back inside, she heard something, a soft rustling, almost like a whisper. "Just the wind," she muttered, though her heart raced, shutting the door behind her. She tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with red eyes, watching from the woods. The next day, she ventured into town, noticing the wary looks people gave her. Old Mrs. Wilkins, the town's historian, hobbled over to her, clutching a small pendant of a cross. "You're the one who moved into the cottage," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, trying to suppress a smile. "Yes? Why?" "Don't go into the woods," Mrs. Wilkins urged, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not just a story, child. The vampire, he waits. He's hungry." Lena politely nodded and went about her day, but as dusk fell, she returned to the cottage. The words played over in her mind. "The vampire waits. He's hungry." That night, the fog was thicker than ever. The moon barely pierced through the dense mist. Lena sat by the fire, reading, when she heard it again. A whisper, but this time closer, as if just outside her window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she set her book down and approached the window. The fog pressed against the glass, swirling like smoke. But there, just beyond the edge of the forest, she saw it. A figure, tall, cloaked in black, its face obscured by the fog. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. She spun around, staring at the wooden barrier. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Her breath caught in her throat. She approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. Who is it?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No response, just silence. Swallowing hard, Lena slowly opened the door. The fog swirled in, and standing there, just at the edge of the porch, was a man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, dark, almost black, bore into hers. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice smooth like velvet. Lena stood frozen, the words of Mrs. Wilkins echoing in her mind. "The vampire, he waits. He's hungry." She shook her head, stepping back. "Who are you?" The man smiled, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. "I am a traveler." Lost in the fog. I seek shelter for the night. Lena's instincts screamed at her to shut the door, to run. But something about him, his voice, his presence, was almost hypnotic. She couldn't move. Invite me in, he urged softly, taking a step forward. I won't harm you. The air grew cold, and Lena's breath came out in visible puffs. She fought the urge to let him in, her hand hovering over the door, ready to slam it shut. But before she could act, he moved with impossible speed, standing inches from her. I don't need an invitation, he whispered, his lips curling into a sinister smile. Lena tried to scream, but no sound came out. His hand shot forward, gripping her wrist with unnatural strength. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt her will, her strength, draining away. He leaned in, his breath cold against her neck, and in that moment, she knew this was the end. The vampire sank his teeth into her flesh, and pain shot through her body. But as the darkness overtook her, a strange calm washed over her. She realized now why the townsfolk feared the woods, why the vampire had been merely a whisper in the night. He didn't just take life, he consumed the soul, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell. As Lena's voice faded, the last thing she saw was the vampire's dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The shadow had claimed its hunger, and in the fog, Raven Glen remained silent, as it always had, waiting for the next soul to fall into the vampire's grasp. The hollow steppes in the dense, fog-choked forests of the Pacific Northwest. The locals had a legend. Bigfoot. To them, it was more than a myth. The whispers in the wind, the cracked branches in the dead of the night, the hollow steps that echoed through the woods. It was all part of something old, something forgotten by time. No one ventured deep into those woods unless they had a death wish. But not everyone believed in the legend. Jacob didn't. A seasoned wildlife photographer, Jacob came to the mountains to capture elusive creatures, wolves, bears, eagles, anything rare and unseen. But the idea of a hulking hairy man-beast stalking the woods? Ridiculous. He heard the tales in the local bar, but Jacob brushed them off. He packed his gear and set out at dawn, determined to photograph the deep woods where few dared to go. As he hiked deeper, the trees grew thicker, blotting out the sun. The air became colder, and the silence more oppressive. Even the birds seemed to avoid these parts. His radio crackled with static, and his GPS flickered in and out. But Jacob pressed on. He set up camp near a stream just as twilight began to settle in. That's when the noises started. It began with a low rustling in the underbrush, distant but consistent. Jacob turned his head, expecting to see a deer or some small animal, but there was nothing. The forest seemed to shift and creak as though it was breathing. As the night wore on, the rustling grew louder, coming from all directions. Jacob tried to ignore it, focusing on his fire, but the feeling of being watched crawled all over his skin like insects. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not an animal, but something walking upright. Just beyond the circle of his campfire's light, Jacob stood, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating twisted trees and dense foliage. But nothing moved. Still, the footsteps continued, now circling his camp, each step sending a deep thud into the ground. "Who's there?" Jacob shouted, his voice trembling. Silence. Suddenly, a guttural growl broke the stillness, reverberating through the trees. It was low, primal, like something from the depths of the earth. Jacob grabbed his camera, hoping to capture whatever was out there. But as he lifted the lens, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was massive. At first, Jacob thought it was a bear, but it stood taller than any man, at least 8 feet, covered in matted dark fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, a sickly amber that looked onto him. Jacob froze, his heart hammered in his chest as the creature took a step forward, its breath coming out in slow, heavy huffs, like steam rising in the cold air. The legend was real, and it was standing in front of him. Jacob snapped a photo, the camera flash momentarily lighting up the creature's face. An eerily, almost human face twisted with fury. The creature roared, its scream shaking the trees and sending birds scattering into the night. Jacob ran. He grabbed his gear, abandoning the camp, and sprinted into the woods, branches tearing at his clothes as the ground sloped downward. But the footsteps followed, closer, louder, faster. Jacob's lungs burned as he stumbled through the dark, his flashlight long forgotten. He could hear the creature behind him, gaining with every step, its growl echoing through the trees like a death knell. His foot caught on a root, and he stumbled down a steep hill, crashing through the underbush until he landed in a shallow ravine. Pain shot through his leg, but there was no time to assess the damage. The creature stood at the top of the ravine, watching him. Its eyes glowed like coals in the blackness. Jacob crawled backward, dragging himself through the mud. But the creature did not move. It simply stared, its breath heavy, its eyes unblinking. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the shadows of the forest. For hours, Jacob sat there, too terrified to move. Dawn eventually broke, and with the first rays of sunlight, he limped his way back to the nearest trail. Shaken, but alive. He told no one of what happened, but the photograph remained, blurry, unfocused, but unmistakable. In the days that followed, Jacob didn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every broken branch, every whisper of the wind felt like a reminder. Bigfoot wasn't just a legend, it was real, and it knew him now. The hollow steps, he realized, never stopped. Even when he was miles away from the forest, they still followed him, just beyond the edge of his hearing, waiting for him to return.